crisscross the land. There were brave men and women who embarked on a journey across the vast, untamed Atlantic Ocean. They were not in search of gold or treasure, but of something far more precious: freedom. Freedom to live as they believed, to worship as they chose, and to build a life grounded in their Christian faith. In 1607, a small band of English settlers arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. Among them were those with a mission that reached beyond survival. Many were driven by a desire to spread Christianity. They carried Bibles, whispered prayers, and held on to a dream that their faith could transform not just their lives, but the history of the world. In the midst of a strange new world, they sought to plant the seeds of Christianity, not only in their hearts, but also among the indigenous people they encountered. A decade later, in 1620, a group of Puritans sailed on the Mayflower, seeking not just a new land, but a new way of life. Their dream was to create a city upon a hill, a shining example of Christian community, where they could live in accordance with their faith, free from the persecution they had faced in England. They were not just seeking refuge from religious oppression, but also hoping to lay down roots for a society built upon Christian ideals. As these pioneers settled along the eastern shores, their faith became the cornerstone of their new communities. Churches sprouted, and every aspect of life, governance, education, and even daily chores, was infused with their devotion to God. Faith and life were inseparable. In this new world, Christianity wasn't just a belief. It was the very air they breathed, the foundation upon which their new lives were built. By the 1770s, the 13 American colonies were growing increasingly discontented with British rule. What had begun as a relatively peaceful relationship with England had turned into a powder keg of frustration and anger. The colonies, originally founded by people seeking religious freedom, now found themselves denied the very rights that had been promised to them. Among the rising tensions, one key issue stood out: the colonists' desire for religious freedom, a principle that would later become the cornerstone of the American experiment. As these tensions escalated, many colonists turned to their Christian faith as a source of strength and guidance. For some, the revolution became a divine mission to break free from the tyranny of a monarchy that seemed intent on imposing its will on them, even in matters of worship. For others, the revolution was a means to preserve the freedoms they had already enjoyed, including the freedom to practice Christianity without interference. Faith, liberty, and justice became entwined in the hearts and minds of the colonists, setting the stage for the birth of a nation. The early colonists had come to America not only for land, but also for religious freedom. The Puritans who landed in Plymouth in 1620, for example, had endured persecution in England for their beliefs. Their religious principles guided their vision for the new world, a place where they could live out their faith without fear of imprisonment or death. Yet, by the 1770s, many in the colonies felt that British rule had become oppressive, dictating how they could govern themselves, and in some cases, how they could worship. The tension began with small acts of resistance, such as the refusal to pay taxes to the British Crown. The introduction of the Stamp Act in 1765, which required colonists to pay a tax on printed materials, was seen as an overreach of power. It wasn't just a financial burden, it was a direct infringement on their autonomy. The colonists, many of whom were devout Christians, believed that God had endowed them with the right to govern their own affairs. The British monarchy, they believed, was standing in opposition to this divine right. The colonists' Christian principles also found expression in their growing desire for justice. As the revolution gained momentum, many Christians in America saw the struggle as one of moral necessity. The unjust laws imposed by Britain, they argued, were in direct contradiction to Christian teachings about justice, freedom, and the dignity of individuals. The oppressive taxation without representation, the forced quartering of British soldiers, and the infringement on personal liberties all felt like an affront to God's law. As the conflict began to take shape, it was clear that many of the leaders of the American Revolution were deeply influenced by their Christian convictions. Men like John Witherspoon, a Presbyterian minister and president of the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University, became outspoken proponents of independence. Witherspoon was one of only 6 clergymen to sign the Declaration of Independence, and his strong belief in the sanctity of religious liberty and human dignity led him to take a bold stand against British tyranny. Witherspoon wasn't the only Christian leader who saw the revolution as a holy cause. Reverend John Peter Muhlenberg, an influential pastor, famously stood before his congregation in Virginia in 1775 and preached a sermon from the book of Ecclesiastes. There is a time for all things, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. As he uttered these words, Muhlenberg removed his clerical robe to reveal the uniform of a continental officer, calling upon his congregation to take up arms in the fight for freedom. His actions made him one of the Revolution's most famous Christian soldier preachers. Many Christians, including ministers, decried British actions as violations of God's will. The American Revolution, for them, was not only a fight for political autonomy, but a struggle to create a nation that upheld Christian values of justice, mercy, and the freedom to worship as they saw fit. For some, the battle was a sacred duty, a call to protect the rights given by God, and to defend the faith that had been so integral to their communities for over a century. In the early years of the Revolution, the Continental Army faced setbacks and challenges that tested the faith of the Patriots. The winter of 1777 at Valley Forge, where George Washington's troops endured cold, hunger, and disease, became a defining moment. Despite these hardships, soldiers and leaders alike turned to their faith, finding solace and strength in God's promises. Washington himself was deeply devout, often turning to prayer and seeking divine guidance in moments of crisis. His private journals and letters reveal a man who believed in the providence of God and saw the revolution as part of a larger divine plan. The Continental Army's victories, particularly at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, were seen as clear signs of divine favour. Washington, his generals and the soldiers often attributed their success to God's intervention, and they fervently believed that their cause was just in the eyes of the Almighty. Even as the war raged on, Christians in the colonies saw their mission as one of divine righteousness. The struggle for independence was viewed as a fight to preserve the freedoms that God had granted them. Some pastors saw the war as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, a sign that America was destined to be a nation where freedom, justice, and Christianity would flourish. The New World, they believed, was the place where Christian values could be expressed most fully. While many Christian leaders supported the revolution and encouraged their congregations to join the fight, there were also voices within the church that called for peace and reconciliation, Christians, though committed to their faith, were deeply troubled by the violence of war and the divisions it created. They prayed for a peaceful resolution and believed that the revolution could have been avoided through dialogue and compromise. Figures like Quaker leader John Woolman and Anglican priest John Newton, who had once been a slave trader and later became a staunch abolitionist, advocated for non-violent resistance and reconciliation. They urged the American colonists to avoid the excesses of war and to seek God's will in a peaceful, constructive manner. But as the conflict escalated, their calls were largely drowned out by the tide of revolutionary fervour. The revolution ended in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, and the young nation was born. America had won its independence, and it now faced the monumental task of forging a new government and establishing a new identity. The Christian faith played a critical role in shaping the values of the new country, but it was also clear that religious freedom would be an essential part of the new American experiment. The US Constitution, ratified in 1787, was built on principles that reflected the Christian values of liberty, justice, and equality. The Bill of Rights, particularly the First Amendment, guaranteed freedom of religion, ensuring that the government could not impose a single religion upon its citizens. However, Christianity, with its deeply rooted history in the colonies, continued to shape the moral framework of the new nation. Many of the founding fathers were Christians, and their vision for America was one where faith played an integral role in public and private life. In the years following the Revolution, Christian leaders continued to guide the nation's moral compass. The legacy of faith that had motivated the colonists to fight for freedom now guided the shaping of the nation's laws, its culture, and its identity. The revolution had not only secured political independence, but had also provided a new framework for the expression of Christian faith in the public sphere. The 19th century ushered in a period of spiritual renewal, a time when the fires of faith burned brightly across the land. As the nation expanded westward and its population grew, a movement known as the Second Great Awakening swept through the country. Christian preachers took to the pulpit with a fervour unmatched by any previous generation. They called upon Americans to repent, to seek salvation, and to strive for a better world. But the Second Great Awakening wasn't just about individual salvation. It was also about societal transformation. Many Christian leaders began to speak out against the great injustices of the time, notably slavery. Abolitionists, fueled by their Christian convictions, fought tirelessly to end the institution of slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, used her platform to expose the horrors of slavery and to call Christians to action. Her writings, deeply rooted in her faith, stirred the conscience of a nation, pushing many to join the abolitionist cause. Meanwhile, missionaries, many of them Christian, travelled westward, hoping to spread the gospel to the indigenous people they encountered. They believed it was their sacred duty to bring the light of Christ to the frontier. Yet, this westward expansion brought with it conflict, as the missionary efforts often clashed with Native American cultures, transforming the lives of these communities forever. As the 19th century unfolded, the nation was torn apart by the issue of slavery. The North, where many Christian abolitionists fought for freedom, clashed with the South, where some Christians defended slavery, citing scripture as justification for the practice. In 1861, the country erupted into the bloodiest conflict in its history, the Civil War. war was more than a political struggle. It was a spiritual battle, as Christians on both sides of the conflict turned to their faith for guidance. Many in the north saw the war as a righteous cause, fighting for the liberty and freedom that they believed God had intended for all people. On the other hand, many in the south invoked Christian teachings to defend their way of life and to justify the continuation of slavery. The war raged on for 4 long years, and when it finally ended in 1865, it brought both liberation and devastation. The Emancipation Proclamation had freed the slaves, but the nation was left scarred by the brutal conflict. Christianity had been a guiding force on both sides, shaping the moral and ethical decisions of the leaders and soldiers alike. The post-war period marked a new chapter for America, one where the Christian principles of equality and justice would guide the rebuilding of the nation. As America entered the 20th century, Christianity remained a powerful force for social change. The civil rights movement of the 1960s brought to the forefront a new generation of Christian leaders who would use their faith to fight for racial equality. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist minister, became the voice of this movement, advocating for justice and equality through peaceful protest and non-violent resistance. King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, filled with biblical references and calls for justice, became a rallying cry for millions of Americans. His words echoed across the nation, inspiring Christians of all denominations to join the cause and work toward a society where all people were treated equally, regardless of their race. Churches became not only places of worship, but also centers of action. Christian leaders were at the forefront of the civil rights movement, leading marches, organizing protests, and pushing for legislative change. Christianity continued to shape the fight for justice, reinforcing the belief that all people were created equal in the eyes of God. In the latter half of the 20th century, Christianity took on a new role in American politics. The rise of the Christian right, a political movement led by evangelical Christians, marked a shift in the influence of religion on national policy. Christians, particularly those with conservative views, began to advocate for traditional values on issues such as abortion, same-sex marriage, and the role of religion in public life. The Christian right became a powerful voice in American politics, influencing elections and shaping public opinion on moral and ethical issues. Leaders like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and others rallied millions of Christians to take a stand for conservative values. Their activism played a significant role in shaping the political landscape of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. And so, the story of Christianity in America continues. The nation has changed in countless ways, but the Christian community still holds a powerful presence in its culture and politics. Churches remain at the heart of many communities, providing not only a place of worship, but also spaces for charity, education, and social activism. From the abolition of slavery to the fight for civil rights, from the establishment of religious freedom to the ongoing debates about the role of Christianity in public life, Christianity has shaped the American story in profound ways. It's a story of faith, struggle, and triumph, a story that will continue to unfold as America moves forward. As the nation faces new challenges, whether in politics, culture, or society, Christianity will remain a powerful force for good, guiding believers and non-believers alike toward a better, more just world. The seeds of faith that were planted centuries ago continue to grow, shaping not just the story of America, but the story humanity itself.